You are in Dartmouth, September 1592, inside the hold of the largest ship England had ever captured. Around you, English sailors open barrels of pepper, weigh bags of fragrant cloves, unroll bales of silk imported from China, and count silver coins scattered across the wooden floor. In your hands, you hold a cedar box. Inside it, a thin piece of calicut cloth is wrapped nearly 100 times around itself. It is not gold, not silver, not spice. It is a document, printed in Macau, guarded as if it were the rarest jewel of the East. That piece of paper exists only because the ship around you, 7 decks tall, carrying 600 men, managed to round the Cape of Good Hope and cross 2 oceans without tearing itself apart from within. The secret of the document and the secret of the ship are the same story. Only no one in Dartmouth knew it yet. That ship carried 425 tons of pepper, along with precious stones, fine silks, and a fortune equivalent to nearly half of everything the English crown collected in an entire year. And yet, that piece of paper was worth more than all of it combined. To understand why, you have to go back to the problem that came first. How a wooden ship of that size even stayed afloat. It wasn't just another capture. It was the largest vessel England had ever seen up close. The numbers recorded by Richard Hakluyt, the chronicler who documented everything, still seem like exaggeration today. 50 meters in length, 14 meters in beam, 7 decks stacked one atop another. To put that in perspective, Columbus's Santa Maria, the ship that textbooks say discovered America a century earlier, was 18 meters long. You could fit nearly 3 Santa Marias inside the single hull of the Madre de Deus and still have deck space left over. The main mast rose 37 meters into the air, taller than a 12-story building. And below the waterline, her loaded draft exceeded 9 meters submerged, the equivalent of 3 full stories of hull pushing against the pressure of the Atlantic Ocean. That matters because wood does not behave like steel. Wood splits, wood flexes, wood absorbs water and rots. A hull that size, with that much weight, should have given way under its own structural stress long before completing a single crossing. And the first proof that these numbers were no exaggeration came before any engineer's calculations. It came in the form of a real battle against an entire squadron. In August 1592, an English fleet financed by the Earl of Cumberland and Walter Raleigh intercepted the Madre de Deus near the Azores. It took a full day of combat to force her surrender. The Roebuck, commanded by John Berg, only managed to capture the Madre de Deus after hours of constant cannon fire against a hull that simply would not breach. And here, the real problem becomes clearer. Wooden ships of that era operated within a physical limit well known to European shipbuilders. The larger the hull, the greater the chance that the plank's seams would open under the twisting force of waves, letting water seep in slowly until the ship sank from within. Most shipyards of the time simply did not risk building on this scale, not because they lacked ambition, but because they lacked a solution to the most basic problem of naval engineering: how to keep a wooden hull of that size dry while crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean, loaded to the limit with hundreds of tons of cargo. The Madre de Deus operated on a scale that most European shipyards considered impossible, and that is exactly why she was not built the way Europeans built. The Madre de Deus should not have survived a single voyage, let alone the second one she was on when captured, but she did. The answer to that contradiction lies not in the sails, nor the cannons, nor the size of the hull. It lies in a silent technique, nearly invisible, applied millimeter by millimeter to every wooden joint of the ship. The Portuguese knew something that English shipbuilders had not yet deciphered. To understand what it was, you have to go down to the hull itself. The answer was not in the sails, nor in the hull's design, nor in the wood itself. It was in what the Portuguese placed between the planks. A layer a few millimeters thick, invisible from the outside, which English engineers would spend decades trying to reproduce without success. The technical name for this process was caulking. Every wooden hull is made of planks fitted side by side, and between those planks there is always a gap. Caulking is the process of closing those gaps by driving material into the seams until water can no longer find its way inside. It seems like a small thing, but on a 7-deck ship crossing the Atlantic loaded to the limit, it is the difference between reaching port and disappearing in the middle of the ocean. The Portuguese had solved this problem with a combination that practically no European shipyard could fully replicate. First, they used a pitch extracted from Iberian pine, a resin more elastic than most variants used in Northern Europe, capable of moving with the wood without cracking. Second, they treated linen oakum with oil before driving it into the seams, which prevented the fibre from rotting under the hull's constant moisture. And third, and perhaps most importantly, they fastened the planking with hardwood tree nails instead of iron nails. This matters because iron was the silent enemy of any wooden hull. Northern European shipyards knew each piece of this recipe in isolation. What they lacked was the combination: Iberian pine pitch with the right elasticity, oakum treatment refined by generations of Lisbon caulkers, and the accumulated experience of nearly a century on the Carrera da India, the longest and most brutal route any wooden ship had ever faced. The English still relied on iron at critical points in the hull. Iron rusts in contact with salt water, and as it rusts, it expands. That expansion cracks the surrounding wood and widens exactly the gaps that caulking is meant to close. The Portuguese had learned, at the cost of lost gnaws, where metal could go and where it should never touch. They avoided this cycle by using hardwood in place of metal, and when metal fasteners were absolutely necessary, they turned to copper, which does not rust in the same way and does not corrode the surrounding fibers. The result was a hull that aged slowly, that withstood years of voyages without opening silent cracks below the waterline. It was not a small advantage. It was the reason a ship of that size could cross the Atlantic twice without tearing itself apart from within. On an English ship built in the same decade, the hull would show visible gaps after a single Atlantic crossing. On a Portuguese ship, the seams stayed dry. That difference was not luck, it was caulking. After capturing the Madre de Deus, English naval engineers tried to replicate the method. They examined the hull, took samples of the caulking, brought everything to English shipyards, and failed. Not because the technique was too complicated to understand, but because it depended on resources that England simply did not have in sufficient quantity. Iberian pine of a specific quality, established trade routes for copper, devots of labour trained solely in that task. Knowing the recipe was not enough, the entire ecosystem behind it was missing. And here, the story took on a harder edge. The Portuguese secret was not an isolated trick that someone could steal by copying a procedure. It was the product of an entire system: cultivated forests, metal trade routes, and generations of caulkers trained from childhood in the shipyards of Lisbon. England would take decades to assemble something similar, and even then, she would never achieve exactly the same result. A hull sealed that way did not just keep water out, it enabled something greater. It allowed a ship to carry hundreds of men and thousands of tons of cargo for months on end without the bottom giving way. Without that caulking, 7 decks were a useless luxury. 7 decks were not a whim of naval architecture. Each served a precise function, stacked one above another like the floors of a building that needed to house, feed, and protect hundreds of people for months at sea. One deck stored ammunition and artillery reinforcements. Another concentrated the heaviest cargo near the waterline to maintain the hull's balance. And the upper decks divided space among crew, officers, and provisions. It was not luxury. It was the only way to make an organism that size function without collapsing into logistical chaos. 600 men consume more than 1,000 litres of water per day, nearly 40,000 kilograms of biscuit per month. All of that had to be on board before departure, because in the middle of the Atlantic there was no resupply, no market, no river to fill barrels. Each extra deck solved a logistical problem, not a comfort issue, and a round trip could last more than a full year. What that floating city brought back, however, is what transforms the Madre de Deus into something almost absurd for its time. 425 tons of pepper filled part of the hold, plus 45 tons of cloves, 35 tons of cinnamon, 3 tons of nutmeg, 25 tons of cochineal, the most valuable red dye in European commerce, and 15 tons of ebony, the dense black wood from Africa. Not to mention silks, tapestries, Chinese porcelain, ivory, and boxes of precious stones scattered across the decks. 400 tons of pepper, enough to supply the London market for years. When that cargo reached Dartmouth, the price of pepper in England collapsed. A single ship distorted an entire national market. That hold was worth more than an entire Italian duchy. It was not a merchant ship. It was a 7-story safe floating on the Atlantic. A safe that size needed equivalent protection. English records counted over 30 cannons on board, distributed across the decks. And the hull received extra structural reinforcement precisely at the points where the artillery was positioned, because the recoil of a bronze cannon firing against the wooden planking created stresses that the rest of the hull did not need to bear. The Portuguese builders knew this and designed the Madre de Deus to withstand her own firepower without destroying herself from within. But when the battle came, what held the Madre de Deus together were not the cannons, it was the hull behind them. The Roebuck, under John Berg's command, did not capture the Madre de Deus in minutes. The fight stretched over a full day, with constant exchanges of fire and successive boarding attempts, because the hull absorbed impacts that should have opened fatal breaches much sooner. A ship built with inferior caulking, with iron nails corroding the surrounding wood, would likely have given way in hours. The Madre de Deus resisted for an entire day. That was not luck. A hull of that thickness, with freeboard so high that the English had to climb to board her, absorbed impacts that would have shattered smaller ships. And beneath it all, the caulking that kept the seams sealed ensured that each breach was an isolated problem, not the beginning of a cascading flood. What should not have floated also should not have resisted a battle of that duration, and yet it did. But what the English found after the surrender was worth more than any cannon on board. Remember the cedar box in Dartmouth's hold, wrapped 100 times in calicut cloth? What lay inside was a document printed in Macau in 1590. Hakluyt described the scene with a phrase that reveals the sheer astonishment of those present. The paper seemed guarded, as if it were some incomparable jewel. No one wraps a piece of paper 100 times by accident. Someone, somewhere along that voyage, knew exactly how much it was worth. The content was not a map, nor a secret treaty of war. It was commercial information, shipping routes, ports of call, prices practiced in the trade between China and Japan. Things that today would look like bureaucratic spreadsheet entries, but which in 1592 functioned as the key to a vault that all of Europe had wanted to open for generations. Portugal had controlled that trade for nearly 100 years, ever since her Norse reached the east via the Cape of Good Hope route. A monopoly built on absolute secrecy, maintained through guarded routes, exclusive ports, and information that circulated only among trusted captains and merchants. No other European power knew precisely where to buy, how much to pay, or how to negotiate directly with Asian suppliers. That knowledge was worth more than gold, because gold is spent while trade route information multiplies. That is exactly what fell into the English lap inside that cedar box. They did not need to decipher any secrets, send spies, or negotiate for decades. All they had to do was capture one ship and open one box. It was not the only push England received. The accounts of the Dutchman Jan Huygen van Linschoten, published years later, were equally decisive. But this was one of the first concrete maps the English ever had in their hands. Less than 10 years later, England founded the East India Company, the very commercial structure that, decades later, would colonize parts of India and dominate Asian trade for over 200 years. The first ships the company sent to the east in 1601 followed routes that existed only in Portuguese documents captured 9 years earlier. That is important because it connects two events that seem separate. The engineering we have discussed, the caulking, the 7 decks, the reinforced hull, solved the problem of crossing the ocean, but it did not solve the problem of keeping a secret once the ship reached the wrong destination. The Madre de Deus survived the water, the wind, and the English cannon for an entire day of combat. She did not survive the curiosity of a chronicler who recognized value in a piece of paper wrapped 100 times. The the ship built to resist the ocean, was undone by a document kept in a box. The hull protected against water. It never protected against the ambition of those who discovered what lay inside. In the next video, the Portuguese technique that the English tried to copy for 30 years, and why every attempt sank. Subscribe now, because that story begins exactly where this one ends, below the waterline. Yeah.